Hello and welcome to the Dairy Signal. We're excited to dive in here this afternoon to talk about something that is extremely important for all dairy businesses, and that is what is your vision? And we're not talking about if you have 2020 vision or not, because I would flunk out of this already if that was the case. But we are here to talk about your business and what is the vision that you have for the business that you are a part of. But before we dive into that here this afternoon, let's talk a little bit about today in history. Now, today in 1940, we had Walt Disney's Fantasia premiering, and you're probably thinking, well, that sounds great, but I don't really care, Amber. But the reason I bring that up today is because it fits perfectly in with what we're talking about in terms of vision. Because in 1940, Walt Disney, he had this vision that he wanted to create this company that was not only going to revolutionize the animation, but also the sound sector that they were a part of. And Fantasia was a huge part of that because it was unlike any other film that had been created before in terms of that it was innovative in the ways that it used art in terms of animation and the sound media, and where instead of having one storyline pull all the way through, there was 8 different sections essentially within the Fantasia movie. And while it initially had mixed reviews, it actually became extremely popular among those who watched it due to its amazing visual and sound technology utilized, and it helped cement Disney's reputation for years to come as a serious art and cultural innovator. So interesting things to be thinking about here this afternoon, especially as we dive into talking about vision and what it means for our businesses. And joining us here this afternoon, we are joined by Tim Schaefer, who's a certified family business advisor and certified professional business coach with Encore Consultants. So, Tim, we are excited to have you back on. It has been a second. So we've had a lot of good conversations before, but for those who might not be familiar with you, would you mind giving a brief introduction about yourself?
Sure thing. So I live here in Minnesota. Grew up on a successful row crop family farm, and started Encore Consultants here about 15 years ago. And since then have really grown and expanded it. And so now I work primarily only with farms and with ag-related businesses all across the US and Canada in a couple key areas. So one is executive coaching and team coaching, leadership development, strategic planning, kind of that whole area. And then the other is succession planning. And those are the areas I work with. I like to slide out a little bit in the fall and do a little bit of pheasant hunting when I can, when there's time. But otherwise, kind of stay busy.
Well, it's been a good year for getting out in terms of weather, at least for the most part. It hasn't been too pretty of weather. So hopefully you're able to get out pheasant hunting here this year. But, Tim, we're going to be diving into vision here this afternoon. I'm excited about that because it's an area where we haven't really touched on it a whole heck of a lot here on the Dairy Signal, but it's a really important part of having a business. And excited to dive into more about what it means and why it's important, as well as what it can look like if we start to figure this out for our own business. So with all of that being said, I'm going to turn it over to you, Tim, to get us started, and then we can have questions throughout. So those who are watching live, please ask your questions, and we will just dive right into it, if you will, Tim.
Perfect. Hey, thanks. I guess the first thing when we talk about visioning, let's talk about what it isn't, right? Let's talk about what it isn't. Visioning is not trying to foresee the future. Right. It's not trying to foresee where milk prices are going to be. It's not trying to foresee things that we don't have any control over at all. Rather, what it is it really boils down, and why it matters is it boils down to alignment. And it doesn't matter whether this is a 1,000 head dairy, a 250 head cow dairy, or a 15,000 cow dairy. People need to be in alignment. And I think sometimes, well, we see it often, right? When we go into family run operations or even corporate ones, people, if they're not talking about it and they're not being very deliberate about building that alignment around a vision, after a while, everyone goes around with their own ideas in their own head. And that doesn't make them wrong, It just means that there's a lot of that there's often enough daylight between everyone's idea of where they think everyone else is going and what they want, that it can create some problems. So this is really about building that alignment so that you can keep up the momentum and not get bogged down in family dynamics, and not get bogged down in daily operational activities either. So I guess my answer to this first slide is it absolutely does matter. And there's a big link to succession planning. Farms that go through that have strategic planning and visioning and basically written business plans, if you will, they make more money, and this is, they make about, when we look at where they fall profitability wise, 56% are at least average and 42% are above average, where we're operations and family farms without any sort of written plans. There's quite a few that are below average and very few that are above average. So it matters a great deal. There's also something that I think, as moms and dads and as parents, what we find is that they just assume that if they raise their kids right, hey, my sons and my daughters, they know what I think. They were all raised together. They've all, been part of this farm for a long time, for decades maybe. And so we're all on the same page. But I think sometimes what we all forget is that, right, they get married. They have different experiences at home. They have maybe different experiences if they've worked off the farm. They have, the industry has changed. Certainly it's changed over the last several decades. And so just assuming that the past is going to play out, or the past and the future are somehow automatically connected, it just really isn't that true. And so really every generation, and rather, probably every decade or less, really should be sitting down. People should be sitting down and saying, okay, where are we at? Where do we want to be? How do we get there? See, working in a family business, it's really confusing, and it's really easy to get out of alignment because we play so many different roles each and every day. And a lot of times we get confused about what roles we play, because we may be we may be over here as owners having a discussion, and then quickly segue into, okay, now we're having an operational discussion, and oh, by the way, we're a father and daughter dynamic as well. And so what visioning does is it builds alignment in these three areas. And a lot of times we're like, oh wow, do we really need a vision for how our family stays together? And I'd say absolutely yes, because it's so common for, as time goes on, for that kind of that, not really for the family to not get along, but just not spend enough time together or enough focus time together that they stay aligned. Now let's look at a sustainable family business. So there's also alignment that needs to be built around family unity. And we were just talking about, how do we stay united? How do we, even as time goes on and we go from brothers and sisters, maybe to a cousin collaboration, how do we keep family unity? Because when families don't get along, or owners don't get along, pretty quick, there's a lot of things that don't work well. Then let's talk about family talent and drive. Need to bring a vision and alignment around, if somebody works in this business, what are going to be the requirements? So it moves the mindset from, hey, what is the business going to do for me? What is my farm going to do for me? Versus, what do I give, right? What is required of the next generation, to say, what sort of talents are going to be necessary in the future? And they may be some things that mom and dad don't have, but but it's going to be necessary. And then finally, family asset growth. This is a lot of times, this is business profitability, but it's also succession planning to where farm assets need to stay together, right? That doesn't mean that there can't be outside ownership, but we can't be fracturing our asset base every single generation, then gathering it all together. That's one thing. It also means that we need to build alignment around, okay, do we reinvest back into the business, or do we pull some out and for living expenses? So these are all areas that require discussion, alignment, and a vision. And Amber, by all means, just feel free to jump in if you have a question. So,
Well, I do, and I didn't want to jump in too much quite yet because I was thinking about this might be something we talk about later in the process, but we're talking about this really very much as like the family unit in terms of this is the family business, and that is very true in many, many cases. And now, I'm thinking about, okay, when we're probably a little bit farther, not only in this presentation, but down the line, we're thinking about maybe creating a vision and what that looks like. But there's other people on the farm who have really helped contribute and be a part of what makes this business really successful. So how do you integrate them into these conversations or into these aspects? Or is it not appropriate, even if they might have a lot of time within the business and the culture that they've created there? And, how do you fit in those people who might not be quote unquote traditional in the way or non-traditional when it comes to the business?
Oh, spot on. So I'm a big believer that whenever you do visioning, it needs to be a collaborative process. In other words, the CEO shouldn't go into their office, shut the door, and create this, and then bring it out and say, well, here it is. And it doesn't matter whether the CEO is family, or it's mom and dad, or whomever, or any other sort of dairy farm or farm. It needs to be a collaborative process, and often that needs to be your leadership team. Not necessarily every owner, but the people involved need to be in the visioning. They need to give their input, because when they give their input and they're heard and their ideas get incorporated into the vision, that is buy-in, right? They automatically have buy-in because they're part of the process. And so even though I use the word family business, everything that we're going to talk about is 100% applicable towards non-family run operations. Who's at the table might vary, right? In a non-family run operation, the people at the table, there may be hardly any of them family, maybe none of them, but they all need to be part of the process. That answer the question, Amber?
That does. I want to say thank you for going through that, because a lot of the times, yes, we sometimes get stuck in our own little bubbles of, well, these are the core people who either started it or are part of it, but there's so many other people who help make a business what it is. And sometimes it might just be, a father, daughter, father, son, or, a couple of family members that are at the table, and there's nothing wrong with either one. It's just that it doesn't have to be this is A, B, and C, and that's it.
Yes. Yeah. But the only hard and fast rule is that if you do have a leadership team, family or non-family, make them part of the process, because they will make it better. They'll see things that maybe the largest owner or the CEO won't. It'll just be, the buy-in will just go way up. You won't have to sell it because they'll be part of the process, and they'll be as excited as anyone. So visioning, a lot of times, in your past, like, well, we're trying to see over the horizon, right? We're and that's a vision, right? We need to get this dairy set up for the next 20 years, and that's all good, right? There's a lot of investments that are made for decades at a time, but if you get so far out in front as you write a vision, by the time you get to about year 4 or 5, there's so many things that have changed that that you can look at that vision and say, well, why did we do this? It's kind of obsolete already. And so we say, hey, let's get, instead of trying to look over the horizon and guess and have things really, the further we look out on the horizon with our own eyes, the fuzzier the picture becomes. But when things are fairly close to us, they get really, really, really clear. That's how our vision works in our eyes. This is the same way. Let's not get it so far out there that it gets fuzzy, because fuzzy means that everyone's going to come up with their own interpretation. Instead, shorten it down. We found that 3 years is a good rule of thumb. 3-4 years, probably not longer than 5. And you make it really, really, really clear. And you write the vivid vision in as if it's already happened. So you would write something to the effect of, it's 2028, and many things have happened here on Daisy Lane Dairy. Our new barn is up and running in our efficiencies, right? So you're writing it in future tense, and it's if you're giving a narrated tour around the farm. That is very vivid, and you want it so clear that you could hand it to a stranger and they'll be able to paint the picture in their own mind. It's got to be that clear.
So Tim, what is the difference between like a vivid vision and a goal in terms of when we think about this? Because when I think about 3 years, I'm like, okay, when we're thinking about where we want to be, essentially that's the goals of what we want to do. And yes, things may change. So could you help us differentiate a little bit about the difference between them?
There might be it might be a distinction without a difference, right? I guess when I hear goals, I think of individual things, like a goal of we're going to put up that barn, or we're going to add 500 more cows or something like that. A vivid vision is much more encompassing, right? It's actually a series. It's a series of interconnected goals.
So it's like the larger umbrella of what's going on.
It's a larger umbrella. Yep.
Okay. Thank you
And
for that.
yeah, great. So what goes into it? You know what? There is no one way of writing a vivid vision. Every farm is going to have what makes sense to them. But what we're going to go through are probably 6 areas that if you answer these questions and then start writing after that, you're going to have a really solid, vivid vision. And so we're going to go through these next 6 items and kind of walk you through. So maybe people listening at home, if they have a notepad or something like that, as we're talking through this, maybe you want to get started. Also, there's going to be a worksheet that if you want it, you can get it at the very end. First thing is pillars. And if you think of what a pillar is it holds everything up, right? You can't have a building without a strong pillar, right? You've got to have some very basic things that aren't probably not real glamorous, but they have to be in place. And if they're not in place, the whole thing comes crashing down. The reason why we have pillars in there, why it's important to have a pillar in, is we don't want this vision to get so far pie in the sky, glossy things out there, that we forget what made us successful, or we forget what we absolutely have to do. And if we don't do them, we're literally out of business. And some of those things that can truly knock you out of business would be let's just say that labor, right? In a dairy, if you don't get labor right, you're probably out of business. If you don't get if you run afoul of some regulations, maybe for groundwater contamination and things like that, you're probably out of business. So these are the things, or milk quality, whatever it would be. It's writing down, we have to get this absolutely right. this, and it's this is also a good time to look back and say, hmm, what made us successful in the past? Was it low debt? Was it that what was it? Was it managing one aspect of our business really, really well? So it's not forgetting our past. It's basically keeping us grounded. So that's the pillars. Then the culture. And this is no different whether it's a family, a smaller family farm, a medium-sized family farm, or more of a corporate structure, to define the culture. And this will go a long ways for a family, but it will really go a long ways with employees. And it starts out with what are our core beliefs and values, but it really goes beyond that. And it says what behaviors, and it really defines what behaviors you see and what behaviors you don't see on the farm. And this could also be, how do we behave as family towards each other? And that's probably, well, that's not probably, that's often overlooked in a family farm, because we just kind of act like family, for better or for worse. And it's being really clear that when you're walking around, you're seeing not only the core values, but probably more important, the behaviors that back that up. So, and having a good culture is often the first step as a farm scales up. Without a good culture, it's really hard to keep employees. Yeah. So employees, teams, and leadership. So now we're talking more on the leadership team and really focusing on that. And it says, what behaviors are evident here? When we talk about what is having a capable and competent team, thinking back a couple slides, we need a capable and competent leadership team. What does that look like? What does capable and competent, how are you going to define that? What skills and trainings, what sort of attitudes are going to be necessary? And I'm going to say, for the future. Don't look back on this one. Look forward, because there's a great evolution going on right now in terms of managing workforce and leadership development.
So, Tim, when we're talking
Yeah.
about this area, and I'm thinking about this in the last three slides we've gone through so far, and as we're thinking about these questions and asking ourselves this, when it comes to employees, team, and leadership, who on your team should be the ones answering the questions that we're going through today and going through right now as we think about vision? I know earlier we mentioned that it doesn't have to be just the family, but who should be in this conversation and who maybe should not be in this conversation? I don't mean that as a dig to anybody, but sometimes it's an area where we want the thought and input, and sometimes it's also on the flip side, too many hands in the cookie jar. So what, from your opinion, creates the best way to get towards a vision? Well, if you're answering these questions, thinking about them critically as we get towards at right now the halfway point of the 6, as we keep going here today.
Yeah. Absolutely. Too many hands in the cookie jar, too many cooks in the kitchen, whatever the analogy is, it can be too many, right? So on one extreme is the person that goes into their office and creates it all themselves. That usually doesn't work. On the other one is being so democratic that you open this up to everybody, and then you just end up with a big mashup. A really good, if you can keep it to 7 or less, it is, kind of that 3 to 7 range is usually you can get a lot of good information. And I would say, don't put a shift manager in here per se. At least not initially. You probably want somebody that is at least in a leadership role. Go ahead.
I'm just gonna ask another part of the question here, and I mean it makes sense from the shift manager. They might not be the best in this position, but I think about, the different dynamics on farms, and you have sometimes the person who or people who might have initially started a farm and now they're a couple generations deep, and you've got grandpa and grandma who are retiring from it, and that leaves one generation, but they didn't really get into this to be people managers. It just kind of happened as the farm kept expanding and growing. And this really isn't their thing. And they just kind of are more of the, well, I have this role because I have to have it. How does that play into it? And I don't want to call anybody out in a negative way because sometimes people are like, this just isn't my forte. And that's not bad. But considering where they're at technically in the leadership team, but also, in the mix of it all, where and how does that play into this dynamic? Because there's a lot of things where it sounds like, yes, the leadership team, that makes complete sense, but depending on who's on that sometimes, it sometimes isn't, the people who necessarily want to be doing some of these areas.
So Amber, are you describing a leader that is a leader by default versus one that's actually doing it or has earned it? Is that a little bit?
I mean, I'm kind of going off of, yeah, that would be a good way to describe it. I don't necessarily mean that these people aren't capable and that they don't do a good job, but when it comes to some of this stuff, terms of like thinking about it in the business way, of what's going on with vision and mission and etc., it's just not something that, it has been a priority to them or might not be an area where they feel quite as comfortable or capable. And that might not be the case for everybody who comes into a situation like this, but I'm just thinking of, sometimes those are the scenarios we end up with, and you have to step up and be that leader. But this is still an uncomfortable conversation or thought process for others.
Yes. Yeah, and I'd say, if there's a person, maybe they're an owner, or maybe it's really not their forte. Maybe at this part of it, they just kind of, they just kind of step back a little bit and let others. But I'm gonna be probably pretty bold here and say there has to be somebody in the farm that is focusing on employees, employee development, leadership, and having a cohesive team. Unless you really intend on doing all the work yourself, and there are farms out there that don't have employees and they literally do all the work themselves. But if you have employees, there has to be somebody that you can bring in, and it may be an outside consultant, or it may be interestingly enough, it may be your veterinary, or your or somebody, one of the advisors that maybe see this on other farms, and they can bring some input in. But I'm a big believer, if you have employees, this area needs to have this whole culture and what we want this to look like really needs to be part of it. I'm afraid that if it's not, and we're seeing these trends, that leadership and employee management, it's kind of defining a lot of farms. I mean, there's some farms that simply cannot grow, cannot expand their production because they haven't mastered this.
Well, and I appreciate you diving into that and being, just saying it as it is, because sometimes, that's what we need to hear. And that's not a bad thing at all.
Okay. And the great news that there's now a one size fits all. It just needs to be brought into focus. All right. Another thing. So when we do our vision, sometimes it's so easy to get caught up into into looking over the horizon and everything, that we lose track of what got you here. We lose track of what's working. And so this is an area that says, okay, what's been working? What do we just need to keep doing? We do it well. We just need to keep doing it so we don't lose focus. So it's very similar to a pillar, except that they may not be quite as critical. So you start listing out everything that's working that you need to keep doing and what that looks like. Oh, and here's where the fun starts. What needs fixing? What is not working well that needs to be fixed? what has maybe worked well in the past, but now is kind of obsolete, right? It's just not working. There's a whole host of things that change, over a decade or even 5 years on a dairy farm. They used to be perfect, and now over time, there's something better out, better, better that you can do. What's slowing our team down? What are the pebbles in the shoes? And the pebbles in the I think sometimes we think that we have to have all these grand, these great, we're gonna, fix this and put it in a new parlor and do all that. Sometimes it's really small things. I call them the pebbles in our shoes, right? Yeah, you can kind of kick them to the side for a while, but man, walk with a pebble in your shoe for a day, and it becomes extremely uncomfortable. So it's big things, but it's also really small things too as well. Opportunities. What opportunities are out there, or trends that we should take advantage of? This may be digesters. This may be, selling power to the grid. This may be better use of water. Whatever it is. What opportunities should we be taking advantage of? And of course, as you go through this process, now you enter into great discussion amongst owners and your team members about what is an opportunity, and how do we go about determining whether it's good or whether it's just average, or maybe it's not a fit. All right. So those are the main questions that as you go through, and if you can answer those, and it doesn't need to be fancy. A lot of times it literally, when we do it with our clients, we just use some software, but it's just bullet points. It's just a few phrases up on the screen. So this doesn't have to be, it can all start out as bullet points. And then from there, you start expanding it out and writing full sentences and paragraphs. I'm going to pause now before we jump into best practices. Amber, any questions that have come in, or do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so how do we take those, questions that we answered, and now they're in bullet points, and you said we're going to take those questions and we are going to make them into this vision. How long should our vision be? Is it something that is going to be, I'm going to be over exaggerative here, that's pages and pages long, but what's kind of that sweet spot that really helps hone in on who we are and what we want and what we're going to be doing, but as well as, making sure we're not talking somebody's ear off.
Make it as simple as possible, but not simpler. And it still has to work, right? And that's Albert Einstein's, that was his phrase. Make everything as simple as possible, but not simpler. It still has to work. I'm as you were talking, I'm going back through my brain of all of these that we've done and that I've seen other people do. I think three pages, with various paragraphs covering these areas. 3 pages is probably the shortest. I think the longest was maybe 7. So, I mean, there is a little bit of writing. It just needs to be clear. You should be able to give this to a stranger, and they should be able to envision what that farm looks like, how it operates, what you're producing, the changes that have taken place over a 3-year period, kind of all of that.
So, and when we're thinking about, this vivid vision that we're having, what's the difference between this that we're talking about here today and say like the vision and mission statements that you often see on, sometimes on the employee handbooks or, on the walls of wherever you're going? What's the difference there?
Well, the vivid vision actually replaces all visioning. The mission, I've seen it work, and I've seen probably more. This is just my opinion, by the way. I've seen just enough of them as like, they're great and they're good, and all, but what do you do with them? Like, okay, so you have this. So how is it going to change behaviors and goals this year, this quarter, next year? It's just so fuzzy. Um, so that's the mission side. The vision side, this actually replaces it, this replaces it. Yeah, going only 3 years out. And if you feel like going out for it, that's fine. But
And when we're talking about when we're creating this and going through, when we're thinking about this vivid vision, when we're doing this and working our way, does this include the how or the implementation side of things?
no, absolutely not. It does not answer how, right? How can be determined later. All it does is say, this is what it looks like. This is what we're doing. This is the outcome. It is defining the outcome, not the process, because that process may change. That process may change over a 3-year period or 4-year period. And so why work yourself into a box? A lot of times, another good practice is you take this vivid vision and you here, this last bullet point, from plan to execution. So you take the 3-year vivid vision, you say, okay, this is what this farm looks like. These are our profits in 3 years. This is how many cows we're milking. This is, whatever that looks like. This is our culture, all of that. You say, well, if that's going to happen in 3 years, what needs to happen in the next 12 months? And that's really where these annual objectives come from. This needs to happen in the next 12 months. Okay, so if that's going to happen in 12 months and we got all of our normal work to do, what do we need to focus on over the next 90 or 100 days? And you start breaking it down into smaller and smaller chunks.
Makes it more
Because
manageable
most
that
vision,
way.
say what?
It makes it more manageable that way when you're able to, instead of looking at it from a big picture, you're able to look at it to a little more bits and pieces.
Correct. And when you get down into this plan execution size, oh, absolutely include the employees that are going to help you execute. Absolutely, they should be. This is where you can give them, even if they weren't part of the small group that created it. Now you can hand it to them, and with that say, okay, what do we need to do in the next 12 months? And then what do we need to do in the next 90 or 100 days? And you start chipping away at it.
So Tim, we had this question come in and I didn't want to get to it too early, but I think now is probably a good time to ask because it'll segue into the next portion here, I think. And you can correct me if I'm wrong. But this question reads, we've got a vision, but how do we live it out with our employees? It feels like that's the missing piece.
Well, more than likely, okay, let's think about it from the employee standpoint. They have task lists and they have duties and they have their work to get done. And they are judged, they're promoted, they're paid by that work. And some of this is a culture shift. It's not going to happen overnight. But I'll just relay what one employee, he told me a couple years later, and he was laughing and he thought it was funny about 3 years later. But he's like, the first time that I saw the vision, I thought, oh crap, now they're expecting me to think. And exactly right. When you put this in front of your employees, you're expecting them to think about how to get it done. So it's starting to shift the culture from, I'm going to tell you, you're going to do it, to now, hey, let's figure out how to make this all flow and come to fruition. And so it's not going to you're not going to flip a switch. Just because you hand them a document doesn't mean that it's going to change overnight. But they need to understand that getting to that vision, working through these annual objectives is absolutely part of their job. And if they understand it, they will buy in, they'll ask questions, they'll get it done.
And so on the flip side of that, when we think about, we've got this document, whether it be 3 pages, 5 pages, seven, whatever the case may be, how do you prioritize what's most important from these areas? Because we went through 6 very distinct areas, but how do
Mhm.
you prioritize what either needs to change or what needs to be implemented most based off of what the questions you were asking earlier?
Yeah. So there's going to be some things that it's like building a building, right? You don't put the roof on first. First thing you start doing is start digging the foundation. Or and before that, obviously you do planning. Um, so you're going to look at this and at the 3-year vision and say, well, if this is what it's going to look like, what is the most logical? Like, you're going to create a sequence of steps in there that you can't put the roof on before you dig the foundation. There's going to be things that pop up in there that say, here's a sequence of events, and you start with number one, and you get that done, then go to step number two. I'm trying to think of an example. Yeah, there's several. There's several examples, but did that answer the question good
I think
enough?
it does. I mean, yes, but no. Actually, let's go back to that for a second.
Okay,
Because
fire
as
away.
I'm thinking about it, I'm like, yes, of course, there's going to be situations and times where you're like, okay, well, obviously A, B, and C has to come first. But we always get to that point, at least, I mean, I feel like, when it's in your workload, whether it's being talking about vision, and regardless, there's always a point where it's like, well, I could do one, two, or three. I have a whole bunch of things in the middle that might not be the first priority, and we maybe get those first priority done. But now there's a whole
Mhm.
bunch, and you're like, well, I don't know where to go next. Kind of stuck in that middle section. And I know they all have equal importance, but I can't focus on all of them at once.
No, you see this down here called quarterly rocks. Those. So what you've described to me is something that maybe won't even take a full year, but they're smaller. And I guess I'm a big fan of getting together with the owner or leadership team, probably 3, maybe 4 times a year, and just really breaking this down and agreeing as a group what what areas are we going to focus on, and you come to a consensus, and what a lot of times what we think doesn't matter whether we do 1, 2, or 3 in whatever order. It might matter to somebody else. It may be really bothering them that it's not getting done, or it may make their job easier, or it may make their area of the execution of this vision easier, and they'll be able to give input. I've yet to see too much confusion between figuring out what to do. Normally the conversation is, oh yeah, when am I going to find time to work on the business because I'm so busy working in the business.
No. Sounds
That's
good.
probably a real that's a more common thing.
Yes. Well, I'll let you keep continuing on because I know we've got a little bit yet to get through here.
Yep.
And I don't want to, hesitate for questions on the end as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. We've already talked about this one here. Collaboration with the leadership, so a collaborative approach. Now, collaboration doesn't mean that as owners you don't have the final veto and things like that. But pulling in ideas, from especially with your leadership team. Another thing is probably quality over speed. This isn't something that people are going to need to think about this. And my caution is don't sit down and hammer it out in an afternoon. That probably is too fast. Rather, I would break this up into a series of meetings, probably not lasting more than 2 hours each. So make sure that there's quality, quality over speed. And a lot of the people say, well, what's the benefit? Is it when the employees get it? Is it the written document itself? Actually, the most important value, it's all valuable, but the most important is actually the process. So don't take shortcuts in the process. Build it, have a quality process. Um, Also write it in future tense. So instead of writing it like we will do this and we will do that and we will do this. Okay, instead write it as we have done this. This is what this firm looks like. And there's a psychological switch, and I don't know what I'm not a psychiatrist, but there's something about saying this is what it looks like versus I'm going to try that makes a big difference. So write it in the future tense. Another thing is focusing on things you can control. So as you write a vision, I think it's important to have in there what your profits are, what your growth has been, and such like that. But to focus on things that you don't have any control over, you're going to lose a lot. You're going to lose a lot of enthusiasm. So really focus on things that you can control or highly influence, if you will. We've already talked about that this doesn't answer the question how. The how comes later. You don't want to dictate how things get done, just what the final outcome is. And if you have good employees, they're going to actually figure out multiple ways to answer how for you. And then we've already talked about, breaking it down into smaller and smaller bites. It's so easy to get caught up into the daily whirlwind and say, well, now it's November, it's December. Now we're going to work on our vision. It's too late, right? You've probably lost too much momentum. People have forgotten what it is. So you really want this vision to be in front of your leadership team every quarter, if not every month, and make sure that it's staying top of mind with them, and that there's progress being tracked. Otherwise, it's just too easy to let a year go by. So those are probably the biggest best practices, I guess. There might be some others.
Well, Tim,
That's it.
I was gonna say I've got some other questions here if you wouldn't mind taking the time to answer them as well, if that's okay.
Let's do it.
Perfect. So first question here, and this one, I left this one till the end because it's a big one. And I think it takes a second to kind of think through, but it reads, what if answering all these questions we don't align?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, so if you're finding that you can't come to an agreement or alignment, or you can't, like, you're just too far apart, then typically where I would look at it as a family business advisor would say, let's go back and look at the core values and beliefs of the people involved. Most likely, if people are working under a different set of values and these values are actually colliding. So in other words, I can't get what's important to me if the other person gets what's important to them. If those values are clashing, then it's really hard to come up with an agreed, aligned future. Let me give you an example. It's actually just there was a dairy we're working with right now. One of the sons or one of the brothers wants a very one of those dairies that is picture perfect. Everything is top of the line. It's tour ready at all time. It's just, but it's a very small herd of a couple hundred. And the other brother, so that's what's important to him, and he wants to do all the work and be hands-on all the time. The other brother, what's important to him is actually profits. And so with profits, you don't necessarily invest massive amounts of money into a pretty barn, pretty cows, and things like that. And so what they want to do with their lives, how much money they want to make, how much risk they're willing to take, they're just clashing. And so they can't, at least at this point, they're not able to come up with a common vision.
And so, how often does that happen? And what do you do in those situations?
Fortunately, that's more rare than I think that's more rare. Where you know, so where they're that far apart. More than likely, it's a vision, and everyone's walking around with it in their head, but and they're close. The visions are close. No one's talking about them. They're close, but there's just enough daylight between them that they seem like they're out of sync. But really, when you start getting them down on paper and you start talking about it, and you start looking at having collaborative approaches to solving it so that it's a win-win, a lot of times they're not that far apart. And yeah, I would say probably 20% of the time they're super far apart, and they probably cannot come together. But most of the time they can.
Well, it's reassuring to hear that for the most part. They might, yeah, like just have that little sliver of daylight in between, but for that they're able to come together. Now, one of the other questions that we have on here reads, we use a vision statement in our orientation. It's simple, but gets across our values right away. Does this replace that? It feels like it's a lot to give to somebody new.
You know what? That's an excellent, I love this question. Not every employee needs to this is a lot to give to an employee, a new hire. Absolutely. So I love this question a lot. What you can do is you can pull out, once this is completed, you can pull out, right? Because we have Microsoft Word here. We can pull out the section that talks about culture. We can pull out the section that talks about how our values are being lived. And we can maybe even pull out some of the pillars, and that's the only thing that they get.
Really condense it down to what's important for new people to know about who the business is, rather than this is everything in the business.
Correct. And so, as an example, if one of your pillars is milk quality, okay, milk quality, and you have a blurb in there, what milk quality looks like, that would be an example of, you definitely want a new hire to realize that milk quality is absolutely important, or that or animal welfare, or whatever it is, or safety, right? There's a lot of vivid visions that talk about safety, not exactly how, but what it looks like. So.
And I think that has a lot of value because, like they were saying, in orientation, it's a great time to talk about those things to start with, but to be able to couple it with where the business is going, but not looking, at where it isn't as well. As we wrap up,
can I add something, Amber,
go
to
for
that?
it.
I would. So once you give it to them, and the pillars and the culture and the behaviors, and it's been defined and things like that, I would absolutely make it part of their employee review. So don't just give it to them once. Bring it back to, like, you can't just change culture just because you show somebody once. But if you can tie that back into an employee review and have themselves rate themselves on a scale, and then you rate them, now you're just simply reinforcing that, yes, this is important. Especially with culture.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of, enforcing. Well, not necessarily enforcing, but really recognizing where your business is at and being able to talk about it in a consistent manner and keeping it forefront in the business's mind. So a very interesting but good way to bring it all back together here. So Tim, as we get towards our final end of the time though together here this afternoon, what's kind of the one or two key take-home areas you really want producers to be thinking about or actively doing after today's discussion?
Key takeaway, a vision is not trying to foresee the future. It is really about alignment. And it doesn't matter whether you run more of a corporate farm structure or maybe of a very traditional family farm type structure. This is definitely worthwhile to have these discussions and to have it written down. This will help not only operations, this will help, believe it or not, it really goes a long way towards succession planning. So maybe if you even have some parents that are very cautious about even starting that conversation, there's nothing saying that you can't start by envisioning the future and having these conversations. So it has many different uses. It's not just for the big people, the big farms. It's not just for corporate, although you get a lot of traction, especially as farms scale up. This becomes even more and more important. Yeah.
Well, Tim, thank you as always for joining us here today. It's, I think, really important to be thinking about this sort of area. And we always say this, winter is our downtime. I don't know how true it actually is because it seems less and less every year, but this is a great time, especially as people are going into the new year. And a lot of times people are thinking about what's next and thinking about their goals. So, I mean, this is a perfect thing to add into what's going on our farm and how do we think about a vivid vision and what it could look like. So with all of that being said, thank you so much for your time here today, Tim.
It was great being here. Thanks.
I also have to say thank you to those who typed in your questions and joined us live, as well as those who are joining in after the fact. We always appreciate you. We have a lot of great things happening in the world of professional dairy producers and a lot of good things coming up. We've got our Dairy Managers Institute headed, well, to Juneau, Wisconsin, here to our office headquarters, where we have a really great 3-tier program where if you are new to management, if you have been in management forever, or if you are somebody who is just really looking to dive in how you manage people, this is the program for you. We also have our Managers Academy for dairy professionals. So if you are on an executive level and looking to really dive outside of the dairy industry, get a glimpse of what's happening in other sectors, as well as now working and really learning from some really great world-class trainers. We're headed to Dallas, Texas with that this January. So those are 2 really people-focused. We talked a lot about people today, but people-focused programs this year. So make sure to get registered and signed up on our website. But for now, thank you for joining us today. I hope you had a really great time. I know I did. And with that, we'll see you here tomorrow on the Dairy Signal. Bye now.